Welcome, everybody, into another space, another chat here from Coinage, the only community-owned, award-winning media DAO steered by our NFT holders and backed by the co-founder of Netflix. I am, of course, the host of Coinage, coming to you live from our Brooklyn studios in New York City. Excited to be joined on this episode today. Again, chatting with us, one of the top hosts in Web3. You know her well. Reilly from Overpriced JPEGs back on Coinage with us. Carly, GM.
GM, thank you for having me. What a lovely intro.
You know, it's been a while since you've been on with us, but I've been seeing you in the courtroom. Excited to have you on for what is this, a discussion on what you've made of the case, because you've been doing these recaps every day, going home. I don't know how you find the time, because I'm exhausted from listening to all the back and forth, but you do these recap videos that have been really, really good. So I'm excited to have you on. Thank you for taking the time to chat with us today about all the ongoings.
Thank you for giving me a place to dump all of the knowledge in my brain about this trial. I'm just like filling up, and like Sam Bankman-Fried trial info is like coming out of my ears at this point. So I need to get it out my mouth so that it doesn't keep happening.
I feel the same way. It's been a lot of dense info coming at us almost, daily. There's a lunch break, but not a lot of time to really digest all this stuff. And
it's not enough time to digest lunch, let alone everything we've heard from the trial at that point.
That's very true. Acid indigestion galore from everyone who's having to go to this. But no, it's been a lot, and you've been. I think it's like to distill everything that's going on in the courtroom is a difficult job, and you've been doing a great job of that. And now I think as we have a little bit of a break right in the action, they're not going to resume the trial until Thursday, so we've got some time to kind of step back and think about rather than day in day out. I wanted to kind of have this chat to kick us off, and we'll get into other Web3 topics later on. But as we always do, I think, the biggest topic in crypto, whether you like it or not, is kind of what's going to happen out of this SBF trial, because, again, it's kind of everyone in crypto is paying attention to it. And we just put out a story at Coinage, Carly, on kind of my take around what the score is. And you've been in there. I mean, you've been watching. I have it at 10-2. It's baseball season. We're coming up on the World Series. So using a baseball scorecard, I have it. SBF losing this trial by a score of 10-2. The government really executing, I think, pretty well here. I don't know what your take is on how far behind he is, but I think generally everyone is saying it's not going his way.
It's definitely not going his way unless all of us are just wildly misreading what the jury is seeing in all of this. Let me ask you this before I score it. Like, walk me through, what does 10-2 mean? You mean like the defense has scored 2 points, the prosecution has scored 10? You're talking about jurors, like 10-2? Like, where are you?
That's how I got it. Yeah, so I understand the 10-2 adds up to 12. That could lead you to believe that we're talking jurors. I'm not going that far yet. I'm just saying, because again, Coinage kind of
has to be unanimous, for him to be guilty, and I think they will unanimously find him guilty. But anyway, continue.
Exactly, yeah. And you've got this idea of, there was a plan in place for the defense. There's a plan in place for the prosecution. Both sides go out there. They try and execute the game plan, right? And Coinage had an early kind of look at what the defense was going to try and push. I think everyone kind of had a general sense of, you got to undermine the testimony from your 3 alleged co-conspirators. Caroline Ellison was the first. And, they haven't really done a great job of that. So in terms of scoring, there's a limited amount of time for both sides to make their case. We're about, I think, almost, generally speaking, through most of the prosecution's case here. So I have it kind of bottom of the 5th inning. It's very difficult to put this into baseball terms, but using a baseball scorecard, I think, 10-2, bottom of the 5th, things aren't looking good if you're losing. It's not impossible to come back from that margin, but it's not likely. And again, I don't think anyone in our poll has the idea of Sam ever getting a not guilty verdict on the 7 charges he's facing. So that's not exactly a win, but maybe getting acquitted on a couple, to your point. You kind of have to have just one juror out of 12 say maybe they haven't proven this beyond a reasonable doubt. So that's kind of the scorecard we're using here.
So arbitrary.
Arbitrary, somewhat of a weird science, somewhat of a what stood out to you. How do you really put it into something that if anyone's looking at a headline can understand?
Yeah. Well, look, it's interesting because it's very easy as you're listening to, frankly, both sides put on their cases. And we haven't seen the defense yet. We've just seen them in cross-examination. But to almost lose sight of the specific charges a little bit. Like, I would be shocked if the jury doesn't feel that way sitting there, because I know I certainly feel that way, where like you're hearing all this testimony, but at least for me, like the back of my mind is not going like, okay, which specific charge is this is this point speaking to or detracting from or whatever? I think that'll be something that they'll obviously have to do at the end of all of this. They'll sit there, they'll look at the different charges, and then they'll have to kind of apply what they've heard to the charges after the fact, which it'll be interesting. To your point, like there's always a chance that he gets acquitted on one. And if I'm not mistaken, I think somebody reported that like that's probably the defense's goal. Like the goal going into this was probably just to get acquittal on like a couple of them, not that they realistically thought they could get him acquitted altogether. I would say the other thing I'll say is I caveat this, like I do feel for the defense in that they have the harder case, not just because I believe their client is guilty, but also it feels like their strategy is to kind of, we keep using this phrase in the courtroom of like to cook, right? They ask some repetitive questions. They're trying to have the stories that have been told by the prosecution retold, but just cast them in a slightly different light in the retelling. But I think in doing that, what they do is they ask a lot of repetitive questions. And this particular judge has no tolerance for that. He is known for wanting to run like a very efficient, fast courtroom, efficient trials. And so the second they get the least bit repetitive, the judge really jumps in and is like, cut that out, stop doing that. Like, what is the new point you're trying to make? Which I don't mind as a viewer because I find it annoying when they're just repeating questions that have already been asked on direct as well. But sure. I do think it hurts what I think their strategy is trying to be, which is to say nothing of the fact that I know a lot of the, I don't want to go as far as to say evidence, but the arguments that the defense wanted to introduce in this case, I think the judge has said a lot of them just are inadmissible because they're irrelevant or there's something else. But so a lot of the things that Sam would like to be able to bring into this case and by proxy his defense, I think they haven't been able to get in. So I'm pointing that out just to give a little bit of the devil's advocate point of view here. But I mean, it is you're doing like mental somersaults to try and figure out what they're even trying to say sometimes in the courtroom or what point they're trying to make. I mean, my many journals of me like taking notes in this courtroom are literally half the time during the cross-examination is me literally writing point ? And then jotting down some speculations as to what I think they're trying to say in any given moment. So I don't know, 10-2, 22. I don't know if I can put a number on it. It just, they're losing. Like I could tell you, I think the couple of good points I think they've made, and they still don't even come close to me to exonerating him.
Yeah, let's chat about that though, because I feel like that is, right, if you're talking about like the big hits, if you're summarizing a game, you really just talk about the big mistakes, the big hits, and in this case, everyone knew it was going to be Caroline taking the stand and what the defense is going to try and do to undermine her testimony, because a lot of Sam's defense was, look, I wasn't the only person running FTX or Alameda for that matter. And there were a lot of things that could have been, done differently. And not everything was up to me. And I also didn't have full information. At least that was the defense that, we at Coinage got from him when I visited him under house arrest, the idea of this is what my defense looks like. To your point, not all of it was admissible in court, and the judge really didn't allow a lot of kind of what Sam wanted to throw in there. But nonetheless, you got Caroline up there. You got Gary Wong, the FTX and Alameda kind of co-founder in cahoots with Sam, his testimony as well. And then most recently, you had Nishad Singh, the basically the head of technology there at FTX, and his idea of what did he know at the time and what did Sam sign off on at the time. So when you put those things together, the whole idea of the defense was basically slated with the idea of showing that SBF was not the only person at fault here. Of course, all three of those individuals already pled guilty. But what did you make of, I guess, how they stood out differently in the way the defense tried their best?
Yeah.
Because to me, it looked like they came out not ready for Caroline, maybe got a little bit more footing on Gary, and then Nishad, their strongest performer.
Well, Gary was first. Gary was first and then Caroline. But yes.
Yes, that's right.
Caroline was actually the second one of the three of the co-conspirators. So let me say one thing to the point you were just making about, I think Sam's defense is, hey, I think it was even a step further than what you just said, which I think Sam's defense was almost like, I quite literally didn't know what was going on because I had these minions, for lack of a better term, who were the ones who were really doing a lot of things, especially when it came to Alameda. I wasn't running Alameda anymore. It really wasn't me at all. Not even just that, like, I wasn't the only one. It was like, I wasn't the one because it was really them. And what I think has been so striking is in hearing these three people's testimony is I think the inverse is almost true. It's actually that at any given point in time, the three of them did not have complete information. But according to their testimony, at least, each of them saw Sam as the boss. So Sam was the only one, as it turns out, that at all points was given full information. Now, maybe you could say he had so much on his plate, he wasn't paying enough attention to certain pieces of information he'd been given. Maybe he really didn't notice X, Y, or Z that was said to him or whatever. And maybe that's true. But I really do think the exact opposite of what he is claiming it is the case. And the specific examples I'll give is something that's come up a lot in court is the fact that Alameda had a $65 billion line of credit with FTX, which was essentially intended to be just an infinity number. It became $65 billion just so that they would never they'd never bump up against their limit. And there was some funny testimony, I believe, from Gary saying that that number kept going higher and higher. Initially, it was like they had $1 million line of credit. Then it was hundreds of millions of dollars. Then the first time they were trying to set it at a number that they thought they would never hit it, they set it to $1 billion. And then they hit that number. And that's when it became $65 billion. And all of this, Gary was changing this line of credit limit at the behest of Sam. Caroline testified that she did not know that Alameda's line of credit was actually $65 billion. Like, she didn't even know what that specific number was. Meanwhile, you have Nishad testifying that he didn't know Alameda was using customer money at FTX until September of 2022, while all the others seem to have known much, much earlier. Caroline says that the use of customer money was something that had been happening since FTX's very founding, like since she took over from Alameda, since before she took over Alameda in 2021.
Yeah.
But Nishad didn't know that. So like you see that each of these individuals didn't always know everything, but Sam definitely did. You, I think, had a different question, but that came to mind to me as you were speaking.
No, I mean, I think it matters, and I think the order of all of this matters too, and the way that the prosecution, and yes, to be fair, the defense has not, if they're going to, put on their case yet. So they're kind of playing with one arm behind their back in the idea of they're trying to undermine these witnesses without being the one steering the show. And, arguably, I'm curious if this was your take too, so much was made of kind of the testimony coming from these individuals who were there with an inside look. But to me, kind of the most damning testimony thus far actually came from Professor Peter Easton, who the defense didn't want to be up on the stand. They basically fought before the trial began to make sure that he wasn't the person. This is a guy who's a forensic accountant and professor at Notre Dame, and one by one, systematically put together a slide deck. It was like I was watching, a presentation in college again. This idea of him just running through where funds were coming from, and showing that some of customer funds were being used in these investments one by one, piecemeal. I don't know about you, but I was surprised because that was actually the one coming into this with an open mind, trying to say, yes, everyone in this country is innocent until proven guilty, but seeing the information that he put together and what the defense was not able to do to say, don't put too much weight on what this professor is saying Sam did with customer funds. It was pretty rough if I was the defense attorney there. And I'm curious to get your take, because after that, I was like, good Lord, sir.
Yeah.
I don't know how unless Sam takes the stand, which we'll get into in a second, like that was pretty damning.
Yeah, I agree. It was very compelling. Now, I will say I thought the defense scored a few points during their cross-examination of him, where they showed he had some some sloppily labeled charts on there, which did undermine to a degree what he was saying on a couple specific charts. I think the best you can say about that is maybe it led the jury to feel like, oh, we're going to take all of his testimony with a grain of salt because he did mislabel or sort of confusingly label a couple of these charts. The truth is, I think most people will come away being like, hey, this was a very compelling presentation. I believe this guy. Oh, he mislabeled, or he kind of confusingly labeled a chart. So I don't know that the defense scored huge there, but it was the first time that I felt like they really at least were able to catch a witness off guard, admitting that, oh shoot, yeah, maybe I didn't handle this perfectly. But it's incredibly compelling. And the other thing that I think was important that we've gotten throughout a couple of different testimonies, but certainly came through in the Peter Easton testimony, is $5 billion of customer money, $4.5 billion, essentially, whatever it was. Maybe it's a little bit less that you can prove came from customer money, but went to illiquid venture investments. And to me, my takeaway from this whole trial has been that's the core problem here, is you took liquid liabilities, you took customer money that could be recalled at any time, and you stuck it in $5 billion worth of early venture investments, which, even if they have panned out, like the Anthropic investment, it clearly looks like it has, were not easily liquidated, could not be so it's the tale as old of time mismatched durations problem, and that was entirely spearheaded by Sam. So when I think back on statements Sam has made, clearly trying to blame Caroline, acting like the problem was that Alameda didn't hedge enough, that Alameda wasn't good enough at whatever they were doing, Caroline didn't even know about all of the venture investments that were being made. Sometimes she learned about them later. They were coming from Alameda 1000% at the request of Sam, who wanted to get in this venture game. And I think that, much more than any failure to hedge, was fundamentally the problem here. And again, we saw that we had a pie chart that showed like what percent of the customer money, where did that customer money go? And a good chunk of it was in venture investments. I think, other was this category that it went to a lot, which I think $3 billion went to other. And that would have been things that Alameda was betting on. But a lot of it was crypto that maybe it went down in price, but it was at least liquid. You could actually get it back to repay customers. So I think that looks terrible for Sam.
Yeah, and I guess, again, in terms of who knew what, I think that was also something I had the defense scoring points for, and then kind of a little bit got undone in the way of they tried to show that Nishad Singh knew about some of the stuff. In his direct examination with the prosecution, Nishad was basically saying, I was always against the money being spent the way that it was. I didn't like all this going to marketing, et cetera, et cetera. And then the defense came in and said, well, sir, didn't you also use some loans to buy a house? And then that looked pretty weird. But then he came back on recross and said, well, I also gave that house up afterwards because I felt bad. And so, again, they've already pled guilty. So no one really cares about what points they're trying to score for themselves unless, you're them and they want to minimize their time served. But for SBF...
I do think that the defense scored the most points with Nishad of any of the three witnesses they cross-examined. Now, Nishad turned out, in my opinion, to be the star witness, or has turned out to be the star witness. Everyone was expecting Caroline to be the smoking gun, and I actually think it was Nishad more than Caroline, to be honest. It feels like a lot of the communication that Caroline and Sam had was either over signal in messages that have subsequently been deleted, or I think really they were just they spoke much more euphemistically, and because Caroline was aware of the use of customer money so early on in her tenure working with Sam, it almost meant that they just spoke about that as an implied thing as opposed to explicitly, versus Nishad, who didn't find out about this until September of 2022 and therefore actually confronted Sam about it in his own telling of it directly. That allowed for a lot more potent testimony on the part of Nishad saying, no, I know Sam knew about the spending of customer money because I confronted him on it, in a way that Caroline didn't have that. And yet, to your point, there were a couple of places where I think Nishad got caught on some slight inconsistencies. The use of customer money, that he used customer money knowing that it was customer money essentially to buy this house. He also, the defense did a good job. They had Nishad walk us through a fairly detailed sequence of events from June of 2022. And then the defense said, well, hey, didn't you tell prosecutors in one of your many, many meetings with them back in the earlier days of you meeting with the prosecution that you were surprisingly hazy or hazier than you thought you'd be or something about the events of June of 2022? And Nishad did ultimately admit, oh, yes, I do think I said something like that to prosecutors, which was just effective at, I think, showing, well, that it's interesting how clean and smooth and crystallized all of the testimony is now for all of these witnesses after they've met with the prosecution 20, 30, whatever times. Whereas the reality is, even coming off of these events, even when they were closer to these events back in December or January, things were kind of hazier for them because they were in this fog of war. And now, again, you spent 7 months meeting with the prosecution and suddenly you sit there on the stand and boy, the story you tell is crisp and clean and concise and clear. And
may
know how things work.
Be
Nothing
weighed.
is that crisp or clear. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, it may perhaps be weighed by the idea of, the judge is going to, at the end of all this, say how much time they should have, sentenced, how much times they should spend in jail as well. So that's the defense keeps raising that.
Less compelling. I don't think any of these people are lying. I don't think they're lying for the prosecution to get less jail time. I think they're telling the truth, but I think their truth has become a lot less muddied and a lot more crystallized and specific than it would have been had you been talking to any of these people right after this stuff was happening, when they were like, well, there was so much nuance to all of it. I thought kind of this. I think their memories have just gotten conveniently crisp, which is different than lying. It's just that they're very precise now in a way that I don't know they would have been. I don't think their story would have been as saleable right after.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of phrasing it. And I guess if we put together what you've seen, and again, this is basically what they're going to do when they get to the deliberation stage, is all of these 12 jurors coming together and putting together what they've seen from trial and what they think is true. And that's what you and I are doing. That's what everyone who's watching this play out is basically doing right now. But if I were to synthesize your thoughts and my thoughts, we'd both have SBF down bad, which is true. And we'd also have now this question of, if you're down bad, anything, whether it's a game, whatever it may be, if things aren't going your way, you want to change some things up. We're still waiting to see if the defense is A, going to put on a case, and B, if Sam's going to testify and take the stand. Your estimation, having been in the courtroom for all this, Carly, how do you see it playing out and what you would be doing if you're SBF or his lawyers knowing you're down bad?
Take the stand. I would be so surprised if he doesn't take the stand. You know, the first thing that the judge said in this entire case, when we first entered the courtroom, everyone, was that Sam has the right to testify in his own defense, that if at any point that decision is his and his alone, he can take the advice of counsel, but at the end of the day, that's his decision. And if at any point he wants to testify during the defense's case, he just needs to stand up, and that will be his signal to the judge that he wants to take the stand. And it's just hard to imagine this person who we know has a pretty large risk appetite, who we know likes to talk, who we know wants to get his story and his side of the record straight or whatever, who at this point must be feeling like he has very little to lose because he must feel that this isn't going particularly well. It's very hard to imagine he doesn't take the stand. And so that's my guess. I think a lot of people feel that way, but who knows? Who knows? What's your feeling on it?
I mean, when you think about how we've gotten here, right, and I think about, the similarities between almost every collapse, and none of them are exactly the same, whether it's FTX, Terra, Celsius, BlockFi, Voyager, and the list goes on. But I would say with SBF, I think knowing him, having talked to him ahead of trial, thinking about where his mind was at in terms of why he even, never considered a plea deal, not that one was offered specifically for him. But I think when you put his personality into that decision, the idea of taking a gamble, I was talking with friends about this actually over the weekend. He's the the archetype of a gambler. A lot of people in crypto are. This idea of yes, I will roll the dice even though the slimmest of outcomes could result. I mean, Sam's the type of guy who's going to want to take a 1% chance on something, even though 99% of times, and we saw this with Elizabeth Holmes, though you could argue that it might have been a good decision for her, he's going to take that 1% shot.
Yes.
And, Bernie Madoff's former prosecutor walked through this with us, and he said, this backfires a lot of times. Most defense attorneys would say, I don't want my client to take the stand. But if you're down bad and things aren't going your way and you got nothing to lose because it's a 1% chance, even maybe myself, I'm kind of risk averse. Maybe I would probably do the same thing.
Yeah.
But it's going to subject him to some really tough questions, I think, from the prosecution. And so far, the prosecution has, I think, completely nailed almost every piece of this case. And so I would be worried if I were his defense attorneys. But I think Sam, in his mind, is saying, I got to do this and I can be better at it than what they're going to throw my way.
Totally. Not to mention, I'm sure Sam is sitting there feeling like he is being misrepresented. The monster caricature that is being portrayed to people who have never heard him speak before. A lot of these jurors are jurors because they hadn't heard about this case and hadn't heard about him. Just the natural human desire to be like, hey, I'm a more nuanced, complicated person than the monster I've been painted to be, feels like it would be very strong. And I think he's very guilty. I think he's a pretty dishonorable person. I have a huge issue with the fact that he was more than willing to take all of the glory, all the magazine covers, all the fame when things were going well. And now it's it's my ex-girlfriend's fault now that things have gone poorly. Even if he is less at fault than I believe he is, I think captain goes down with the ship. You owned 90% of Alameda. You were the CEO of FTX. Don't pretend now that oopsie whoopsie, it's everybody else's fault. It's their problem. That's incredibly dishonorable. So I don't have a particularly
the age-old defense of the oopsie whoopsie defense, which I enjoy.
Really, that's what his defense has been historically. So I don't have a favorable opinion of him, and yet I also think he's probably a more complicated human being than the person that he seems to be. If you've only heard from this testimony, when you hear him speak, when he was on his media tour, there's nuance there and there's complexity there, to be sure. So I think there's just a natural desire to set the record straight about yourself, if nothing else.
Yeah, and I think that's a good segue actually into the idea of what comes next, because it sounds like, again, we're both on the same page that he's going to take the stand. But the next kind of chapter here, which has already started to come out, is both sides essentially weighing out jury instructions, which I think, again, as I've seen these cases before in front of jurors who are objective, don't know too much about crypto, don't know too much about all this stuff, they have a lot of questions. If deliberations are going the right way, if you're the defense, you're going to want questions, because otherwise, when we looked at this, if it's a short trial, prosecution's great, because that's all they want is very simple. Fraud is fraud. No questions needed. Let's get out of here. And the so far, this trial has been pretty speedy. But looking at some of the jurors' instructions from the defense and the prosecution into this next chapter is going to be interesting to see how the judge rules, Judge Kaplan, on some of these things. And to your point, oopsie whoopsie, getting into that for how they present the jury instructions, because yes, I think everyone knows, obviously, the way that it resulted in customer shortfalls, not good. But is it illegal in the sense of these 7 charges? And looking at the kind of early jury instructions that the defense has filed, again, the judge hasn't ruled on these yet, but Sam's defense is trying to say, the fact that you may think something is morally wrong or unfair is truly of no interest whatsoever in kind of judging against guilty versus not guilty for these 7 charges. Essentially saying, look, you got to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he committed one of these 7 charges, or all of the 7 charges, one by one. And I think that that's kind of going to be, I think, where the complexity, again, works in the favor of the defense, where people might get lost, even trying to show that these are commodities for commodities fraud because the prosecution needs to do that. Does that get lost in some of this? And so I'm very interested to see kind of what questions the jurors have in ruling as we get closer to deliberations. And again, I think, what the defense wants to put on in these cases, whether they call witnesses, will start to kind of solidify around. Even the Anthropic example is a very good one, Carly. You raised that one. The idea of the judge said, no, you can't really bring up Anthropic in terms of the cross with these witnesses because it doesn't matter what Sam was able to do with these venture investments. It doesn't matter if a guy misappropriates funds, used customer funds to buy a lottery ticket, and then wins. The crime was he misappropriated the funds and bought a lottery ticket when he shouldn't have. And so now he hasn't necessarily ruled out the idea of the defense using Anthropic in the sense of showing maybe some of these things could have worked out for customers. Yeah. And I don't know whether or not that's going to sway any jurors, but I think this chapter gets very interesting.
Well, I think those two things you just said there actually cut against each other, because if the defense both wants it made clear that just because you think something is morally wrong doesn't mean he's guilty, but they also want to introduce the Anthropic piece as if it's a defense, like just because something's morally right also doesn't mean that you're not guilty. And what the Anthropic defense does, in my mind, is it demonstrates that there was less moral harm here, perhaps. There was less harm done, and it was maybe less morally bad than it might have seemed if they are able to get all their money back to customers. But that doesn't make it not illegal. And this gets to, I think, one of the more compelling pieces of evidence as well that we haven't talked about, which was on Thursday of last week, getting to look at the terms of service, and that it was very explicit in the terms of service that FTX would not touch at least digital assets specifically of their customers, and that was not to be loaned out, not to be used by FTX, et cetera. And that felt like a hole to me before we actually saw the terms of service and got testimony from somebody who was not happy to be there, but about the fact that those are the terms of service. I think it was a little bit more just hearsay up to that point of individuals saying this is just morally wrong. But once you see the policy, it feels pretty clear that something, beyond just a moral wrong has been done. But I'm with you. I think, like, I don't know that on every point, they might get bogged down to try and prove guilt on every single individual point. On the commodities fraud piece, that was testimony we got on Thursday as well, showing some clips of Sam even, or some writings from FTX indicating that ETH and BTC are commodities in their view, which was their attempt to try and get some proof on the commodities fraud piece.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think so. On the terms of service point, that was just one thing that I slammed the defense for, because during Caroline Ellison's testimony, she admitted she didn't read the terms of service either, and it's like, the defense just didn't even basically ask her any other questions. You're the CEO of Alameda Research, you're using FTX, you didn't read the terms of service, and they could have made a bigger deal out of that than they did, but they didn't. And yes, on this question of kind of, all right, what happens now? I've been dragged, by the way, about this take, but I think it's objectively true. And I think it's objectively true because the defense wants to include discussion of some of these bets that panned out, and the prosecution does not want them to be mentioned. And I think the reason there being, objectively, the outcome does matter if you're just kind of looking at this, again, something's illegal if it's illegal, but the outcome sometimes sways the appearance of the decisions and the intent. And that is important because criminal intent is the piece that the prosecution needs to show. And one that the defense, I think, will lean on is, look, there were other ways. If this was really a Ponzi scheme or a scheme to just take customer funds, it would have been more blatant. It would have been more straightforward. And the idea here being that, as the defense tries to lean on some of this stuff, I think it does start to maybe muddy the waters. And, I think the Anthropic one is a very good example because it, Sam put money into it. It's now worth more. That, if he had done all of these, would have been a good decision. I'm not saying good objectively, but I mean, it looks different. And I think that is also playing out, Carly, in the claims markets, because the claims for FTX have also been moving up. And I'm not saying that's anything to do with Sam or this trial specifically, but I think optically, generally, if people get their money back, right now the claims I think are at like 52 cents on the dollar, which is I think a high watermark as this has been unfolding. It changes, I think. Again, not saying it's not illegal, but it's hard to say that it doesn't really impact anything at all, and the jurors aren't really going to see any of that, but they might hear about it when the defense puts their case on if they want to talk about it.
I mean, it doesn't change the criminality. It just changes the way it morally feels. And so the question will be, will the jurors allow that fuzzier feeling to impact the way they judge the criminality? I tend to think jurors are smart, and this doesn't impact the criminality. So, like, I don't think that they'll weigh it that highly. I mean, Martin Shkreli is the perfect example, right? Martin Shkreli defrauded, was, accused of securities fraud by defrauding folks who he made money for. Right? Which is a very rare thing. Like, he was thrown in jail even though he made money for the very people that he was supposedly defrauding. And I don't know the ins and outs of his case, but I know that was true. And, he's a unique example because of the Pharma Bro stuff. And, people were kind of out for blood there. But the point being, like, even if you make money, if you steal money and make money with it, it doesn't change the fact that you took money you weren't supposed to be taking in the first place, even if you then return it. Right.
And that's something that we heard that from Bernie Madoff's former prosecutor as well. And he's tried some other cases or defended them. I'm not entirely sure which side he was on, but that was also a point made too. I'm not sure if crypto bros after the collapse are any more sympathetic than maybe Wall Street bros were after 2008. And he was like, look, depending on which wave you're in, sometimes there's nothing you can do. And I'm not sure how sympathetic Sam might be on the stand either. I mean, we've talked about Elizabeth Holmes. And, I think a lot of that may have been some theatrics involved too. I mean, talk about her being a mom, very different than SBF being a 30-year-old man.
I literally think she got pregnant so that she could claim to be a mom on the stand. That's how calculated I think she is.
Carly said it. I didn't say it, but Carly said it.
I said it.
I think it would look different if I said it.
I think she absolutely got pregnant. In the timing of her pregnancies, I'm like, I think this woman is such a sociopath. I think she's probably more sociopathic than Sam.
If Sam gets pregnant, ahead of time, I don't know how that changes things for him, but yes, I think it's dude, I don't know. I mean, I think everyone basically, I don't know if you've had these discussions with other people who've been in the trial or the courtroom too, but I mean, I'd say it's like a 99% chance that Sam testifies because he can't afford not to, essentially.
Yeah. I agree. I think that's sort of the consensus. And I've seen it shift. I feel like initially crypto reporters, we all thought that he would testify, and it felt like the mainstream outlets were a little bit more like, I don't know. And then I feel like at this point, everyone's like, yeah, he's going to testify. What has he got to lose? And, I think maybe the best case scenario for him is he endears himself to the judge a little bit so that he gets a lighter sentence or something.
Yeah, so far that has not been the case. I feel like that's a whole nother story in and of itself, is just how bad the judge does not like Sam's defense team. I don't know if that's been something you've also picked up on.
Oh, totally. But I think Kaplan has high integrity, is my sense, the judge. And so I don't think I think he's somebody who has been at this long enough and wouldn't let a certain dislike for the stylistic preferences of the defense to impact his ruling, his sentencing. Like, I think he'll really look at the facts to determine sentencing, would be my feeling. I have high regard for Judge Kaplan. I do.
Same. And I think, he's been ruling it fair. He's been ruling it straight. I'm not going to say otherwise. But I do think, let's step back even further and maybe put this into context too, because I had the same feeling for Nate Chastain's trial. So the old OpenSea trader,
insider trader.
He's just working there. Yeah, and got convicted. 3 months. The judge in that case also said something very interesting, I think, which was, look, government, I don't think you'd be bringing this case unless it was an NFT insider trading case. You're trying to make an example here. So therefore, I'm leaning a little bit more lenient on the sentencing here. Nate got 3 months. And so I don't know what happens to Sam in terms of sentencing. That's looking too far ahead. But I am kind of interested to pivot outside of the SBF case itself, Carly, because there's other headlines to discuss here in the world of Web3 too. And one of them, this is pretty good segue, is looking at Reddit and the idea of moderators there with the crypto token Moon, and basically the announcement coming from Reddit saying that they were going to be shutting that down, and we saw Moon completely crater. But there were some moderators who dumped some of that earlier before everyone else realized what was happening. So it's kind of reinvigorated this discussion around insider trading in crypto, in NFTs. And I don't know, it's kind of like a hodgepodge mix of all of this stuff where it's a real gray area. And I'm curious to kind of get your take. One, because we've talked about Reddit being kind of one of those fun examples to point to of like a big tech company really leaning into Web3 and leaning into crypto. And now maybe not so much. And then B, I guess, what it maybe, signals to the space again about insider trading, if I may use the term.
So I haven't tracked this story super closely because it's been breaking since the trial and I've been so trial consumed. What I will say is, A, I think it's important to draw this distinction between the Reddit Avatar program, which is their NFT program, which I think in some ways, at least certainly in my world, has gotten more attention than even the Reddit crypto piece. So these are two different programs. I've interviewed the Reddit team about the Avatar program, about the NFTs, and it's something that I do think really highly of. I think they're an example of a tech company integrating blockchain into something they were already doing and just allowing the blockchain to enhance what they were doing, which I think is a really great model for how this stuff can work, as opposed to trying to like do some side thing over here that's blockchain explicit. Like just integrate it into what you're already doing. Now, it's interesting because I had tried to get more information from them at the, many months ago about the crypto side of what they were doing at Reddit. And I was told, oh, it's a different team than the NFT side. We don't really know. Like, it was hard for me to get information there, which in hindsight now looks a little bit like inauspicious, I think, that I like couldn't get more intel into it, and wasn't really put in touch with anybody about it. Let me ask you this. The moderators who sold Moon, was it before the announcement came out at all, or it was just before the announcement had really penetrated and like people really understood what was happening?
Yeah, so I think that's always a very interesting way to look at some of these things, because information in the crypto scene, as we both know, is shared very quickly and sometimes too quickly, in that some of this stuff comes out. Cointelegraph might not be true. But this one in particular was roughly 30 minutes, according to the report from CoinDesk, before the announcement. Moderators with inside info of the impending news sold roughly, I think, in 3 different trades that were looked at here, close to about $100,000 worth of Moon. Jeez. So it was in fact before, and it was substantial in kind of showing some of this stuff. So,
that's gross. I think that, I don't know enough about the law around this stuff, and I guess I don't know enough about Moon to say whether I think it's a security or a commodity or what, but I think that's bad.
Well, it's definitely bad, but I think that's, again, kind of the interesting thing when we look at the examples prosecutors choose to go after, right? It's like, this would be a definite one. It's got all the sexy makings of...
They might go for it. They might go after
moderators, And like, again, Nate Chastain, we were talking about it. It's like 60 grand maybe. And the judge in that case, too, was like, this is the smallest amount I've ever seen prosecuted. And in this case, it's even more. And it's definitely impacting people who held it and bought into the idea of like, okay, Reddit's doing something cool here, which is always, I think, where the anger and disappointment comes from, is the idea of, these things sometimes attract not even people who are trying to really speculate all that much, but want to see something actually be done to support the narrative of crypto's good, or some of these things can help communities or help, to your point, be integrated in things that already work and make it even better. So yes, this is one that I think will get more attention, and obviously the arc of justice takes time. So we'll see what happens with this one, but never good. I would agree, not good. Definitely in the category of bad, but one that I think is good to throw into kind of this discussion around what's illegal and how, the government and prosecutors might look at some of this stuff. Outside of all those things, Carly, this is another one that I think, I'm pretty sure, I don't know if you had an interview with the WorldCoin team too. It seems like everybody got real excited by what WorldCoin was doing at the time. The new announcement here that they're shifting the rewards for operators, with these orbs being passed around, from USDC to their own token World, which would then, therefore, boost the supply. And we're seeing World come down a little bit. I'm always interested in kind of the idea of tokens, and this goes to Moon as well, like tokens being used, how you can appropriately scale those without hurting your early adopters. Tokenomics and a lot of this stuff gets very complicated. But this is an interesting shift for, again, Sam Altman-backed project that's talked about in every circle. And a lot of people like to hate it.
Yeah, I am not a WorldCoin hater. I've gotten my retina scanned. I'm officially in the WorldCoin system.
I didn't know that.
Yep. I'm a UBI fan, and Sam Altman was a supporter of Andrew Yang, whose presidential campaign I worked for, and Sam's genuinely a big UBI fan. And so at the highest level, the idea that we need to verify humanity on a global scale to someday have some sort of universal basic income program. I like fall in the like tech bro idealist category that likes that somebody is shooting for that. I also don't share. I'm not as worried about the security stuff as other people are. Just having heard enough conversation from Sam and from, I forget the name of the gentleman who's running WorldCoin, but I don't know. I mean, the whole world at this point feels like it's really just a big question of like, how much do you trust Sam Altman? It's sort of like what the future looks like no matter how you slice it. So I'm sort of like, sure. With that being said, I really don't like this idea. And this is my first reaction to it because again, I haven't been following anything outside of the trial, so I haven't heard this news yet. But my gut reaction to it is really not liking the idea that you switch from USDC to World. It feels like I'm kind of over this idea that like everything has a coin, and now you just introduce this double risk because if something bad happens to WorldCoin, then something happens to the world, which then becomes this death spiral. I mean, it's literally what we watched with FTT, and I just want more of these companies to just use USDC. Like that seemed lovely and great and fine and independent from you as a company. And now, God, we have to deal with everybody's getting paid in your freaking bespoke token and coin. And I just, I'd have to look more into it, but my gut reaction is quite negative on that.
No, it's a very good point, the idea of double risk on all this stuff too. And what exactly is a token? You think about FTT and what they were trying to do with that. And it was like, okay, we'll use revenues from FTX to buy back a certain amount. It's like, that kind of looks like a security. What's really going on here with all this stuff? And yes, I would agree with all of that. And I keep forgetting, I mean, the Andrew Yang UBI convo here, I do think WorldCoin falls squarely into, something that's trying to be used as a tool in a larger solution to a larger problem. So I think that it's an interesting project to discuss just because of that fact by itself. But I also feel like, there aren't a lot of projects like that in Web3 that are really trying to kind of tackle something. And, you are probably the perfect person given your background with Andrew Yang and the idea of UBI. But to your point on Sam Altman, I do think that is interesting because that's another similarity, right? The idea of like FTX, FTT, yes, sure, but also trusting the people who are running these organizations. And I feel like, isn't that the lesson we keep learning, is like putting our faith in that people are going to do good things? And like, I saw someone else talking about his testimony, and I don't know if you remember what he said, like, I'm doing this because I do it for the good of the game. And everyone's like, well, hold up now. We've heard that before from a lot of people. So that sets off alarm bells.
I know, it's scary. Look, I like Sam Altman. I've met him briefly when I worked for Andrew. We did a fundraiser at his house in San Francisco, and I like him, but I don't know. I don't know him well enough to really know what's going on behind the scenes. Like, as far as, tech autocrats or like, these like powerful tech folk go, Sam has always felt to me, Altman, not to be confused with
we gotta be careful here.
Has always felt like one of the better ones, and I do have to say, I do think there is something distinct about AI. I think these people are terrified of it. Like, I think all of the big tech people are scared, and they genuinely feel like they don't entirely know what they're building with this, which I don't think was the case when Mark was building Facebook. Like, I don't think Mark was at any point really afraid of Facebook. I still don't think he's that afraid of the power of Facebook, despite what we've seen it do globally. I think all of these people are genuinely scared of AI and really do think it could be like a humanity, like extinction level threat at some point. And so I think all of them are taking it seriously in a more genuine way than they took other things seriously, because I think they're genuinely kind of afraid of it.
Well, I'm always interested in that too, because are they afraid of AI, or are they afraid of open, what Sam's building getting too far ahead? Like, are they just trying to basically say, like, hey, let's pause on that because we want to catch up too? Like, it can't be just that guy.
You're saying like he made it closed AI because he didn't want the competition to catch up?
Well, that, and also, the competition also being like, hey, we should really take a closer look at this because we're all going to die. And it's like, we're all going to die if Sam's running it. But if we do AI, then it might not be as bad. And I think it's kind of like a little bit of that too.
I think they are all afraid of AI, but I do think that there's plenty of hubris to believe that, like, if I steward it, it'll be we have the best odds. And so they all want to be the ones to steward it because they all think highly of themselves, which I'm sure a lot of that is totally misplaced. But I don't know. Yeah, I don't know who the right person. I don't know if it's like a Dumbledore thing, like those who seek power are like least equipped to handle it or something. And we should just like put the power in somebody who doesn't want to have power at all and be like, you are now the steward of AI. And it's somebody who's like, please, I'm begging you, I don't want this responsibility. And we're like, that's why you're right for it. So maybe that's what we should all do. But
it only took us 50 minutes. I'm glad we got a Harry Potter reference in there at some point because I was like, we're overdue for one of these bad boys. But we got it in, ladies and gents.
Yeah,
But
and
I
it
do
wasn't
think,
even
I
in the
mean,
Caroline Ellison section. What do you know?
yes,
Who would
it could
have
have been there too. Yes. I mean, I just feel like there's so many pieces of this that like now I feel like the whole space is sensitive to any time there's ever an alert that we might be veering from our idea of, wait a minute, this isn't an ideal. This isn't a Web3 kind of like thing we should be fighting for. And the idea of decentralizing some of these things and putting all the faith in one person and one big company is always kind of like an alarm bell again. And
Yeah.
maybe we lean too far in that direction sometimes. But I do want to kind of close with this because we've been talking about a lot of different things in Web3 and a lot of different projects to pay attention to. There is, of course, one promo we would add here, and I think this is also squarely in your wheelhouse as a company that's working on utility-based project. Blackbird and their CEO, Ben Leventhal, is going to be coming on with us tomorrow. I don't know how much you've paid attention to Blackbird, Carly, but the idea of kind of pairing memberships in Web3, NFTs, in real-world use cases again, real-world problems to solutions, or solutions to problems, rather. What you make of that, because they're kind of trying to build a restaurant membership service, and the idea of that being a successful project, and then they raised $24 million from Andreessen and others. I would say a lot of big things happening in Blackbird.
Yeah. Yeah, I like the idea of Blackbird quite a bit. I have the app. I live in New York. New York is the place where they started, New York City, with their like loyalty based for restaurant blockchain, whatever, that you did a better summary than I just gave. It's been something that I like has been on my list of like, I want to go try this and go to some of their early restaurant partners and experiment with it. I haven't done it yet, but like I said, I do have the app. I think it's the app, right? Yeah, I downloaded the app. It's on Base, but the app itself isn't like,
yeah, it's on Base, which is also another interesting thing. I think the only reason I really saw them at first was they did on-chain summer with Base, and that was a big activation. And yeah, they're on Base, and you can mint an NFT. You have the app. You have Fly Token. There's a lot of different things being used by Blackbird.
It's exciting to me in the sense that Ben Leventhal founded Reilly and founded one other restaurant.
Reilly and Eater.
Yes. Okay. Reilly and Eater, and so. That's a cool resume of somebody to then do something else in restaurants using blockchain. So that was really the main thing that caught my attention was just I thought having Ben at the helm of this was interesting. And I like the premise of loyalty has always been something that I found to be a compelling use case and argument for blockchain. So restaurant loyalty, blockchain, Ben Leventhal. I'm like, hey, those are a group of things that I think is
smell a good
but
project
I haven't gone
here.
too deep on it. Again, I haven't actually used it yet, but I've been meaning to.
Yeah, same. And I think I owe that to that team as we have him on tomorrow at 11 a.m. I feel like I definitely owe...
tonight, you're going to
tonight I'm going out somewhere.
Restaurant.
I don't know where yet. I'm going out there. I'm going to be tapping something somewhere. I'll tell you that much right now. But no, Carly, I love having you on, and it's always good to have you back with us to kind of walk through a lot of this stuff. We always close, as we have, with the discussion of bold calls, because it's always nice to get people's bold calls. I know your mind has squarely been focused on the SBF trial, so it can be, if you want it to be, SBF trial related for bold calls here. But that's generally my last question to you in general is Carly Reilly's big bold call for here we are in October 2023. What are you looking at? What do you see coming up on the horizon?
I admire people who are really good at predictions. And good at predictions doesn't have to mean you get them right. It just has to mean you lay out an intelligent case for some interesting specific prediction. I am not somebody who has found herself to be good at that. Like I just can't, my brain doesn't even like go to very specific predictions typically. So I'm not gonna have anything mind bending here. Let me think though. What is
I feel like last time we had you on, I could have sworn you had one that was right. And good.
Well, we did do a prediction specific episode together, I think. You and I, in which case I would have like put more intentional thought behind them. And, if I build up, I like will spend time trying to figure it out. I mean, look, I am bullish. I think Q4 is we're going to get a good run on crypto here in Q4. I think obviously for reasons that people are expecting that the potential of a Bitcoin ETF, but the real one, not a fake one like we got. I think the Bitcoin halving happening in April as that really starts to hit people. I think there's been so much expectation for so long of like the next recession that's looming. I feel like that's still weighing a little bit on markets. And even the sense that the markets are kind of down now. Like I don't know. Interest rates we're certainly not going to get any more interest rate hikes. I don't think. I think we may even start getting cuts going into early next year. So I would say, yeah, ETH and Bitcoin prices higher than people, rip even more than people are expecting.
Yeah,
I don't know what people are expecting, to be honest, but that'll be my goal.
Well, I mean, if you look at historically, since, I mean, I can't remember the last time we're sitting here having a conversation where Bitcoin's north of $31,000. Like, I mean, and you think about how rough, I mean, devastating last year was. 2022 is a rough go, ladies and gents.
Yeah.
And now to be sitting here still,
It's interesting that ETH was at like what, 1,600 last I checked. Like ETH hasn't like kind of ripped the same way Bitcoin has, I guess, because of the ETF thing. So maybe I'll make my prediction more about ETH specifically, because weirdly I feel like ETH is like lagging. I feel like usually when ETH is at like 1,600, Bitcoin's at like 21,000. Like, it feels like Bitcoin has moved a little bit more. Am I wrong about this? Again, I haven't been as
No, you're definitely not wrong at all, because our community had voted to actually rotate some of our treasury, of which you are also a participant here, rotated the Coinage treasury from all ETH into a little bit of Bitcoin. And, the Bitcoin Ether kind of trading back and forth, like that pair, ETH has definitely been dented. And you think about Bitcoin dominance now, 51.8. I mean, yeah, there's been a lot of excitement on the Bitcoin front, and we were a little slow to that community proposal, so that one's on me, because we haven't actually executed a bit of the treasury rotation. But that is the DAO life, man. Some of this stuff takes time to get the votes in, to do it all. So it is a bit tricky. But yes, I like that prediction. I like the idea of people maybe sleeping on ETH as Bitcoin gets all the attention, but you extrapolate far enough out. I mean, the excitement's back, ladies and gents. This to me
and
feels
NFTs
like
being the last thing that things will flow into from there. I think things rotate from Bitcoin and ETH into NFTs as crypto does well, and then stabilizes at like a higher price point.
I like that call. I think that's a good way. I think that's a good way to end this chat.
Good end.
Carly Reilly, the host of Overpriced JPEGs, ladies and gents. Carly, thank you again for coming back on. I will see you this week in the courtroom to chat again about SBF's trial. Thank you again, everybody, for listening. That does it for our weekly recap of the biggest headlines in crypto and Web3. For Carly and myself, thanks again. Tomorrow we'll be chatting with Ben Leventhal from Blackbird at 11 a.m. Be sure to tune into that one. Thanks again, and have a great rest of your Monday.
Thanks, Zach.
And thanks, Carly.